Hello everyone, my name is Tim Diggs. I am a TapRooT instructor with System Improvements. And I'm going to be speaking to you today about questions to always ask about work direction in a root cause analysis interview. So when you're talking about work direction, you're talking about a focus on supervisory problems. And in that focus, there's three aspects to those supervisory problems: job preparation, worker or team selection, and supervision during the work. Work direction is not limited to just looking at one individual person and examining mistakes they may have made, but includes all three of these aspects. And so when you're asking questions in an interview or doing an analysis in work direction, it's important that you have a good understanding of all three of these different aspects. So before we get into what questions do we need to ask about work direction, let's take a moment to talk about all three of these particular categories. So first off, when you are analyzing a problem or asking questions about the work direction category, the first thing that you will have to do is identify who is in charge. Who was the supervisor or the team leader doing this work or overseeing this process? And something else that we need to consider as investigators is to also ask ourselves, did this person know that they were in charge? Too often we see where people are kind of thrown to the wolves, right? And just set out among the team to start leading them. And so something that we need to be considering when we're asking questions about work direction is, what is this particular team leader's experience? Have they been trained on the tasks and methods to prepare these workers and guide and supervise them on their tasks? Now, supervisors wear a lot of different hats. Think about your processes or your organization. Those supervisors aren't always just limited to overseeing a particular job task. They may have HR responsibilities or keeping up reporting paperwork, job completions, things like that. So in those situations of analyzing a work direction problem, we need to keep in mind a reasonable level of expectation for direct supervision during a particular task. Was this particular task so critical or so dangerous or so hazardous to quality that we needed that supervisor directly overseeing these workers during this time? Too many times supervisors get beat up, right? They're an easy scapegoat. You see a lot of investigations that somewhat blame the supervisor when an incident occurs and the supervisor was not exactly on scene during that particular incident. Well, that's when you need to ask yourself, was it expected for us to have our supervisor there during this task to prevent this incident or at least help guide and lead the workers? Or was this particular task something that, we don't necessarily expect the supervisor to be directly involved? Like on our slideshow here, we're not going to expect the supervisor to come supervise me to tie my shoes, right? But if we're doing something very critical, very high risk, like here, we're building some scaffolding, well, this particular task may require immediate and direct supervision. So when we are designing the work processes, our work processes, we need to be thinking about what tasks in our process does require this immediate, direct, uninterrupted supervision. When we're asking questions about this in an investigation, something else to think about. Not only was, this was a critical piece to our step, the supervisor did need to be there. Well, how are we as far as assigning tasks and duties and help to the supervisors? Just like supervisors wearing a lot of hats, is there enough assigned supervision and adequate assistance for these supervisors to be able to dedicate the necessary time to manually overseeing these specific tasks? Now that's our first focus, is the actual supervision during work and understanding that aspect. The second one is preparation. Now in preparation, this is where we're going to be looking at those hazard assessments, those toolbox talks, and those pre-job briefings. So just like with the supervisor, when we have to ask ourselves, hey, has this person been trained? Do they know how to supervise? Do they know about the task and the methods to keep workers safe or keep the quality level up or the efficiency level up and things like that? We have to ask ourselves what kind of guidance is given to these same people who are responsible for these pre-job assessments that we do. Often in investigations, you'll hear people throw out reasons like that the toolbox talk didn't do, or the pre-job brief didn't or should have. Well, we have to ask ourselves, for those folks who are in charge of doing these pre-job analyses, what kind of guidance have they been given? How do they know what to look for and prepare for? Hindsight is always 20/20, and there's no human being out there that's going to have that crystal ball to know every single thing that might come up at any given amount of time. So, like on our slideshow here, this is an example of that type of guidance. This is the hazard wheel that has been developed by Dr. Matthew Howe. And so the hazard wheel gives guidance during those hazard walks for these supervisors to ensure that they're not overlooking any safety hazards in their sites and things. So what kind of guidance are we giving these supervisors and team leaders when they're preparing these pre-job discussions? And is it reasonable to expect this particular problem that happened to be identified during these pre-job talks? And pre-job briefings should have covered. I mentioned that already, that sometimes we beat up on that. Was it reasonable to expect this to be covered? We had the luxury of seeing an incident, a real-life incident that one of our TapRooT investigators was working on. And the initial root cause that had been assigned was that the pre-job brief, it was something bad with it, that the pre-job brief should have covered this situation. And that's why we had this problem. So it was directly blamed, or blame was put towards the supervisor that they did not cover this aspect. So to give you some more detail about this problem, the exercise that this particular company was doing was actually training people how to climb towers. If you can imagine, this was a very tall tower, real high up in the air. And the supervisor led the pre-job briefing. They covered all of the recognized hazards, did everything they should do. The trainee started to ascend the tower with his mentor, and about halfway up the tower, the trainee passed out. Luckily, the trainee was clipped in. He didn't fall, but then they had this issue of getting this trainee down the tower. Well, it turned out the trainee had not eaten breakfast that day. And so the pre-job brief and the supervisor were kind of blamed for this, for not asking that question, hey, did we all have breakfast today? So is it reasonable to expect that we're going to include breakfasts in our pre-job brief? If that is a reasonable expectation, then that assessment of that the supervisor should have covered this and asked questions about that is applicable. But we have to ask ourselves, what guidance do we truly give to know, to check for things like eating breakfast, okay? What kind of guidance is given to those supervisors who perform these tasks so they know what to cover in these pre-job assessments and meetings? Now, finally, the selection of worker. It's common that you may hear the supervisor should have known better than to select this particular person or this particular team member because. Well, again, a question to ask ourselves, how does this supervisor know this worker is qualified to do this work? So there's traditional ways of knowing that through trainings and certifications and testings of your workers, mentor programs, signing off on these workers that they are qualified to do this work. But there's also somewhat untraditional things to think about here. Like, for example, how does this supervisor know this worker is qualified to do this work? How does the supervisor recognize fatigue or someone not being alert, or recognize someone being emotionally upset or even impaired? So when we're asking questions about the work direction category in the TapRooT system during an investigation, we also have to ask, was it reasonable for the supervisor to detect this particular type of problem with this worker? So asking questions about a work-directing problem should not be limited to not only what was the supervisor doing during this event. Interviewers, we need to consider all three of those aspects of work direction: preparation, selection of worker, and supervision during work. And keep in mind, in every one of those aspects, what kind of support have we given the supervisors? How do they go through their daily tasks? How do they supervise their workers in critical points? What's needed from them to do that? And what support do they get? And keep in mind, most importantly, to always think about what levels of supervision are necessary for this particular task when you're analyzing a problem. Now, if you would like to learn more, not only about the work direction category in TapRooT, but the 6 other root cause categories, you should look at joining us for an upcoming public course. Or you can connect with us on these different social media outlets and continue to expand your knowledge on the TapRooT Root Cause Analysis system. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.